Good morning. I'm going to continue with my series on the history of the World Championship, and we're back in 2008 with the Anand making his first challenge for the World Championship. There had been a unification match. In 1993, the chess world split in two. Nigel Short qualified through the candidates to challenge Garry Kasparov for the World Chess Championship in 1993. And the two players agreed on the venue and the sum to be played for the match. Got sponsors and everything. Wasn't costing FIDE anything. Great television coverage. I know this because the match went ahead. But FIDE decided, instead of taking that offer, which would have earned a prize money of £1,000,000 to the players, a huge amount of money in 1993, really, for a chess player. No, FIDE decided to accept a bid for half the amount in some, I'm not quite sure where, in a match which gave the majority of the money to FIDE and the uh, yeah myself I consider FIDE to be a fairly corrupt organisation then, as it is now, and Kasparov and Short didn't agree with this. They said, we're professional chess players. We can't. How can you expect us to earn less than half what we could earn for this match? This is a joke. And so they played their own match, set up their own professional chess association, and there was two parallel world championships. So no undisputed world championship until the reunification match between Topalov and Kramnik in 2006, the famous Toilet Gate match. So this is Kramnik, who had beaten Kasparov for the PCA World Championship. That was a big stumbling block. He wouldn't relinquish that title, but he'd lost the title to Kramnik, and then the way was open for a reunification match, which took place, and Kramnik beat Topalov, and this is his first defence of the newly reunified, undisputed world championship. Whatever we might think about Vladimir Kramnik, and there's a lot that could be said about his bad attitude to other players and his thinking that for some reason he is the saviour of chess, and for some reason he is the right man to crusade against those who he decides are cheaters. The terrible consequences that has had for people. He's almost become, if it wasn't so tragic, he would be a joke. But it is worth remembering, because I'm concentrating on the chess here, that in his time, Vladimir Kramnik was an absolutely wonderful chess player. Nobody else could have put in the hard work, study necessary to beat Kasparov. If Kramnik hadn't beaten him, Kasparov might even now in 2010, 2008 have been the world champion. So that was a fantastic feat, and he was a really, really thoroughly well prepared player who understood every opening and was particularly difficult to beat. Almost impossible to beat with white when he had the white pieces was his reputation at this point in time in 2008. So let's see what happens in this is the third game. The first two games were drawn. So in this third game, Kramnik has the white pieces and Anand has the black pieces. Kramnik plays d4 and Anand plays d5. c4, c6, a Slav defense. Knight f3, knight f6. So knight f6 is aimed against the d5 pawn, so that so that can't be overwhelmed with moves like e4. So the knight comes, so there's again maybe threatening to overwhelm with e4, and the pawn comes to c6, e6, and this is the semi-Slav defense, something at which Anand became a recognized expert in after this match. This was the first time that a semi-Slav had been played in the World Championships since the match between Capablanca and Aliekin in 1927. There were other games between Kasparov and Karpov in the so-called Meran variation, but none of those started as a semi-Slav defense. So, and I think most of these games were draws, and it was recognized as a drawish defense, the semi-Slav, particularly Meran variation. So the pawn comes to e3, so that the bishop supports the pawn on c4. The knight comes to d7, doubling them up, and the bishop comes to d3. It is often delayed with moves like a3, bishop, d2, sometimes queen c2, but white wants castle kingside and can't castle kingside before the bishop moves, so you can't delay it forever. But why delay it in the first place? You delay it because as soon as the bishop moves, you take, okay, big deal, the bishop takes, but now it's taken 2 moves to get the bishop to c4 where it could have gone in 1 move. And not just that, then the pawn comes to b5 and the bishop goes back to d3, so it's taken 3 moves from move 5 to move 8 for the bishop to come to d3 where it could have come immediately. It did actually come immediately, but you understand. Okay, so what has black done with these 2 moves? Oh, well, he's expanded on the queen side. His pawns are somewhat weaker, but he might at some point in time be in a position to play d5 and break down white structure and create a pawn attack on the queen side. So he plays a6 to support this pawn so that he's in a position to play c5. So now he's in a position to go to attack on the queen side, and the theoretically accepted method when your opponent attacks on the wings is to counter attack in the centre, and vice versa. When your opponent attacks in the centre, the theoretically accepted method is to counter attack on the wings. So Kramnik does the theoretically correct thing. Bishop comes to c5, and now we enter a complicated series of exchange which becomes increasingly more complicated. And I don't necessarily mean Kramnik and Anand because these are people who can handle complications brilliantly, but I think there is a tendency in amateur games to go for lines which are far too complicated, and if you go for a complicated line, things can go wrong, and this ends up being a very complicated sequence of exchanges. So he threatens the knight. Instead of moving the knight is threatened with the pawn. So the knight takes the pawn. He's still threatening to take the knight, so he's that way winning a pawn. But not really, because when the knight takes with the pawn takes. Get rid of that nonsense. So the pawn takes. White can't now play bishop takes knight. Bishop takes pawn because queen comes to a4 check. Picks up the bishop. It would also be problematic taking the pawn on d4 for more complicated reasons. So he castles to make it safe to take the pawn. And the queen comes to b6, defending the pawn on d4 and defending the pawn on b5, ideal square. And the queen comes c2, doubling up the pressure on b7. So you might think the complicated exchanging is over now, but well, not really, because now he's gonna play bishop to b7, so that if the pawn is taken on b8, then on b5, then Anand is threatening to take on c3, and then if the queen takes, the bishop on b5 is undefended, but the rook on e8 is also undefended, so it's complicated. So he takes the pawn, and the bishop comes to d6. He's looking to play queen to a6, and then do that complicated exchange. So the rook comes to d1, threatening the pawn now on d4, so he's threatening to go 2 pawns up. Can't be defended by e5 because the e5 pawn would be pinned against the king. So the king comes to g8, so that he's now threatening to play bishop takes here. Would be pinned, the queen would have to take. So the pawn comes to g3 and the rook comes to g4 and defends the d pawn. So the bishop comes to f4 and interferes with the defense of the d pawn by the rook. So he takes, and he takes with the knight. He doesn't take with the pawn, he takes with the knight. So he's now a piece down, but he's got an extra pawn and might be in a position to win a further extra pawn. But yeah, he's a piece down. So it is made more complicated. But when the knight moves, the rook is attacked. So he plays h5 to defend the rook. And now he goes 2 pieces down. But no need to worry. He's getting one of them back immediately with rook takes knight check. Sorry, not check, but he's threatening a discovered check, which could win the queen. So the king has to go to f8 to get out of that discovery. And the queen comes to d4, d3 even, to defend the rook. But even better, he's threatening to come queen here and then queen here mate. So he has to do something about that. So the rook comes to g7 and he takes the rook on g7 and then takes the pawn. And he's not a piece down anymore, and in fact he's 2 pawns up. But that king is very exposed, and a rook on g8 will make that king even more exposed. But Anand plays a clever in-betweener here. He attacks the queen first, so the queen must do that defending of this attack from a worse square. But he chooses the best worst square, where he attacks 2 pawns, this pawn and this pawn. This pawn's defended by the queen, this pawn's undefended. So the king comes to h6, where he defends the pawn and opens up the possibility of playing rook here, check. King comes to f1 and the rook comes to g8 anyway. So he's got the threat of playing bishop here, check. And yeah, then he is forced to come here. He's making an escape square for his rook, actually. So the bishop comes to g2. Obviously, he can't play to g1 because then bishop to f3 is check, and he picks up the queen. So he has to play king to e1. The bishop comes to h3, threatening check on g1, which would pick up the rook on a1. He can't play here. Well, he can, but it's a very weakening move. But he plays the rook out. The rook comes to g1 check, and the king comes to d2. Queen comes to d4, finds another check. If the rook comes in the way, this pawn is taken. So the king comes to c2 to defend the pawn. Again, a clever little in-betweener from Anand. He makes sure that the pawn has to move so that the second rank is open instead of just going directly to a check. And then he plays the check, and when the bishop comes to d3, it's taken away an escape square for the queen. And the bishop comes to h3, and he's threatening rook to g2. There isn't anything white can do about that. So he makes a break for it with his pawn. If he can get a new queen, all's well that ends well. So rook comes to g2, he pushes the pawn again. This allows Anand to take on his terms. So he takes, says check, and the king comes to, the bishop takes, and the bishop comes to f5 with a new check. Yeah. If he puts the bishop in the way, then bishop takes, bishop check, and if the rook takes, then he plays queen take, queen to c5 check, and picks up the pawn on a6. So he has to play king to b3. Queen comes c3 check, and now he's threatening to win the bishop. And he wins the bishop, and he's now got a queen and bishop against the rook. But the pawn is only one away from queening, and it doesn't look easy to stop. It isn't easy, but it's possible. And Anand knows exactly how to do it. The queen comes to c4 with check. King comes to a1, and the queen comes to f1 with check. Are we looking for a repetition? No. King comes to a2, and the bishop comes to b1. And now, if the king comes here, the queen comes here, check, and covers the pawn promotion, and the queen can then come here, and the bishop can come here. So the pawn will never promote. And then once the bishop's there and supported, he can move the queen out of the way, and he can always give the rook for the bishop for the pawn, because then he will have a queen against rook. Yeah, and if the king comes to a1, then the bishop comes to e4 check, and then takes the pawn here, and is covering the pawn on c7. So covering the queening square for the pawn, which is on a7. Sorry. So Kramnik resigns, and Anand takes the lead in the match, 1-0. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to at least one of my YouTube channels. Thanks. Bye.